to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation. Hi, I'm Katherine Vandebelt, the Global VP of Clinical Innovation of Health Sciences of Oracle. As a pharmacologist working in the pharmaceutical industry for 33 years, it's an honor to kick off the day and provide additional context and background for our largest annual event, the Galien USA Awards, to be held this Thursday, tomorrow in New York, in conjunction with our annual Galien Forum of speakers representing our top scientific experts and leader in global health. Because the mission of Galien is innovation to improve the human condition, we have developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, and Best MedTech products great visibility in describing their journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien USA Awards has a record 67 nominees for our 3 categories from 54 companies covering 13 diverse therapeutic areas, ranging from cancer, cardiology, neuroscience, to infectious and very rare genetic diseases. We'll be looking closely at the products in all these critical areas throughout the week. So today, because a number of the nominees and the range of conditions represent all this excellent science, the Galien USA Awards Committee has decided to host a series of 10 webinars prior to the forum and award ceremony on Thursday, when the winners of each of the best of the categories will be announced. You may be meeting one of them today. 10 webinars will drill down on different therapeutic focus of the products, the quality of the science behind them, and most important, the patient clinical impact. And it's intended to give our award attendees, the media, and the public a fuller picture of the innovation behind the medicine. In the Best Pharmaceutical category, which is our focus today, we'll be holding 4 webinars due to the large number, 23, of products representing this important field. Members of the award committee decided to arrange each of the 4 webinars to center on the specific therapeutic drug segments: chronic disease, solid tumor cancers, hematologic cancer and other rare diseases, and infectious disease and reproductive health. So we're kicking off the day with 5 nominees in the chronic disease categories. What we will cover today relates to this central fact: the ability to claim larger health system productivity benefits from the introduction of cures and treatments for chronic conditions depends on the ability of patients to access them. And access depends, in turn, on the funding of future investments in drug innovation, particularly as this therapeutic segment becomes more crowded and competitive in the years ahead. Now, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as you hear what our panelists have to say. So look down in your Zoom and you'll see a Q&A button. So please list any of your questions that you might have there. Now let's find out who will be joining us today. I'd like to introduce our 5 nominees that represent scientific and clinical aspects that have joined us today to talk about these great inventions they brought to the market for our patients that need them. We have today with us Dr. Eric Perlman, who is the Senior Medical Director for Neuroscience, U.S. Medical Affairs at Eli Lilly and Company. Welcome, Dr. Perlman. We also have Dr. David Platt, who is the VP and Medical Unit Head for Cardiovascular, Renal, and Metabolism, U.S. Clinical Development and Medical Affairs for Novartis Pharmaceuticals. Welcome, Dr. Platt. We have Dr. Sandy C. Tai, VP, Medicine Team Leader for Amyloid, Rare, Neuro, and Cardiovascular in Pfizer Global Product Development. Welcome, Dr. Tai. We also have Dr. Sailija Bhaskar, the Executive Director, Clinical Operations, Planning at Eldon Therapeutics, a subsidiary of Purdue Pharma. Welcome, Dr. Bhaskar.
Hi.
Hi. And additionally, we have another member from the Eli Lilly and Company family, which is Dr. Douglas Slichting, who is the Development Director of Immunology Product Development for rheumatoid arthritis and COVID-19. Wow, that must be a busy job. Welcome, Dr. Slichting. So those are the panelists that will be with us today. But before we get started and get to hear from them, I'd like to ask you to consider an answer to this poll. So, what is the most important single element of a future global policy agenda to advance health innovations that improve the human condition? Universal access to medicines and vaccines, investment in population-based primary care, prevention and the social determinants of health, empowerment of women, reproductive planning, and expanded education for young people, multilateral collaboration in health policy, including a return to US participation in the WHO and other global agencies, or more public trust in science. Please let me know what your thoughts are to this question. We'll give you a couple more moments. Thank you for responding to our poll. We'll have a chance later on in the webcast to actually hear what you had to say and have a chance to respond to that and maybe hear from our panelists what they think about that. So let's hear from our wonderful panelists. We're so gracious to have them join us. They have put together wonderful packages about medicines that mean a lot to our patients. You'll have the opportunity to read more about them. You're going to receive the ability to read their 100-word statements as a member of this webcast. You're going to have the opportunity to be able to click and read all about their particular products. But let's get started. Let's hear from our panelists, and so, which is what you've come to learn about. So the first question I'd like to ask of everybody is, why did your company choose to focus on the disease state and indication associated with the product? And in what way did the product represent a therapeutic breakthrough, and how significant was the level of the unmet medical need? So everyone on the panel would love to share this information with you. So I am going to start with Dr. Tai. Would you like to kick us off?
Yes, hi. Thanks for the question, Catherine, and the opportunity to be here. At Pfizer, we pursue the development of Vendikal for the treatment of transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy, which I'll refer to as ATTR-CM. We have been interested in this area because ATTR-CM is a rare and fatal condition for which there's a significant unmet medical need. In fact, for untreated patients, the average survival is about 2 to 3.5 years from the time of diagnosis. And prior to the approval of Vendikal, there were no approved disease-modifying therapies for patients with ATTR-CM. And management of patients really relied on symptomatic management of their progressive heart failure. And in rare cases, some patients can receive an organ transplant, a heart and/or liver transplant. So bringing forward a medicine specifically targeting ATTR-CM has really been a breakthrough for these patients on a number of levels. First, I think the impact in terms of the demonstrated therapeutic effect, where we demonstrated efficacy on what we believe are meaningful clinical endpoints, particularly in our clinical trial, what we did demonstrate was that patients who were treated with Vendikal experienced a reduction in the risk of all-cause mortality, a reduction in the frequency of cardiovascular hospitalizations, and also a reduced decline in their functional capacity and quality of life. But what I would add, though, is that the impact goes well beyond the direct treatment effect. I think the impact of having an approved therapy has also led to increased disease awareness and increased diagnosis. And some of the increase in the diagnosis rates is somewhat affected by the fact that now there's a non-invasive means to diagnosis of ATTR-CM. So, until recent years, really the diagnostic paradigm involved a tissue biopsy, whether it was getting tissue from the heart or some other part of the body. And now diagnosis can be made by radionuclide imaging with bone scintigraphy. And what we hope is really the outcome or impact of that as well, is that with the ability to screen patients with increased disease awareness, having a non-invasive means to diagnosis, that patients would hopefully be diagnosed earlier in their disease course. And the reason why that's critical is that what we found from the data in our own pivotal clinical trial is that patients who are treated earlier in their disease course with Vendikal experience greater treatment effect and therefore better benefit to the patients.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tai. I apologize for that technology glitch. I was unable to get off mute. It sounds like what I had also heard was this is actually one of the first medications to actually hit the market in this particular area. And when you actually see some of the investigators that actually had a chance to work on this particular medication, it was actually quite emotional to see some of them interviewed around this particular area as well. So congratulations on achieving that. So thank you for that. Dr. Perlman, would you like to share with all of us why your company chose to focus on the disease state and also what the product represents with respect to the therapeutic breakthrough as well?
Sure. Thank you, Catherine, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with the Galien Foundation and such a breadth of innovative products. So I'm here representing Rayvow, which is an acute treatment for migraine in adults, and quite the opposite from what we just heard. Migraine is the most prevalent disabling neurologic condition and the third most common disease worldwide, affecting up to 1 in 7 people. To put that in perspective, migraine is more common than diabetes, epilepsy, and asthma combined. Migraine is associated with high levels of disability and financial burden on society worldwide, affecting more than 10% of the world's population with an economic impact of about $13 billion annually in the US alone. In the last 10 to 15 years, there's been over a 15% increase in years lost to disability due to migraine. Eli Lilly and Company has been focused on preventive and acute migraine treatments for many years, including work on the serotonin 1F receptor agonist research effort that ultimately resulted in Rayvow. The focus on migraine treatments was based on the high number of patients that were not receiving maximal benefit and or could not tolerate adverse effects associated with current therapies. In particular, the effort that led to the discovery of Rayvow was initiated to provide patients with an acute migraine therapy that did not have the vasoconstrictive properties of the current triptan standard of care treatments. We know that there is still significant unmet need even today with all of the innovative therapies that have become available. In the US, for every 100 people impacted by migraine, 72 do not get an appropriate acute treatment as defined by the American Headache Society and the American Academy of Neurology. Rayvow is a novel oral medication that strongly binds to the serotonin 1F receptor subtype, which is located both centrally and peripherally. While the precise mechanism isn't known, Rayvow is the first and only FDA-approved Ditan and is brain penetrant and presumably exerts its therapeutic effects by acting on these receptors. Now, it's still early on the use of Rayvow in the clinic. It was launched in the US in the first quarter of 2020, just at the onset of the pandemic, when Lilly decided, for health and safety of all, to cease direct clinical promotion and educational work for this and most other products. But that noted, Rayvow is now growing in clinical acceptance and use. There is new Rayvow data confirming that those who took Rayvow had greater odds of achieving superior pain freedom at 2 hours post-treatment compared to those taking placebo. In addition, significantly more study participants who treated their migraine attacks with Rayvow achieved pain freedom and pain relief at 2 hours in 2 out of 3 attacks with Rayvow versus those on placebo, even if they previously tried triptans that were ineffective, intolerable, or becoming contraindicated. And this is a really important treatment group.
Thank you, Dr. Perlman, for as family members that have had migraines and have had to live with them, and those of you that maybe have hadn't had the opportunity to experience it, you are lucky. It's a very debilitating and awful disorder and illness to deal with, and often steals you from many opportunities, both work and personal, that you get to experience. So thank you for bringing that treatment to those that can now enjoy those opportunities in their life. So greatly appreciate that. I'd like to turn to Dr. Platt to share with us similar information about what Novartis has brought, and share again why their company chose the disease state and how the product is a therapeutic breakthrough in their area. So Dr. Platt.
Thanks, Kathy, and it's great to be with you. So, heart failure has been an area of significant unmet need for many years as the leading cause of hospitalization in adults who are over 65 years of age. In fact, it actually comprises 1 to 2% of annual healthcare costs in the US, with an increasing incidence. We think that by 2030, 1 in 33 people in the US will have heart failure, and a 50% risk of death within 5 years of disease onset, which actually has not changed a whole lot since I was a medical student 20 years ago. So Entresto was developed with the goal of improving patients' lives by reducing heart failure hospitalization and mortality. So back in 2006, Novartis researchers sought to reimagine medicine by combining a novel neprilysin inhibitor, sacubitril, with the angiotensin receptor blocker valsartan to develop Entresto, which is a first-in-class ARNI, or angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitor. And this was actually the first breakthrough in heart failure treatment that we had seen in over a decade. So the landmark Paradigm HF trial that came out of that development program was actually the largest heart failure study to date, and it was stopped early for overwhelming efficacy of Entresto compared to enalapril, which had been an established standard of care for heart failure with reduced ejection fraction up to that point. So Entresto was subsequently granted a priority review and accelerated approval by the FDA. It was added to heart failure guidelines with a class 1 recommendation for patients with heart failure reduced ejection fraction, which makes up half of the 6 million patient population of heart failure in the US. And since its introduction, we've had a chance to gather a lot of real world evidence since approval that's shown that patients treated with Entresto are less likely to be hospitalized with heart failure and incur lower total healthcare costs versus patients who are treated with ACE inhibitors. So really appreciate the opportunity to share that and look forward to further discussion. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you very much. And being in the age group as I get older of being women and knowing that heart disease is something that I need to pay attention to, it's great to know that there might be great medicines out there in the event that I might need them, and hopefully I don't. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Bhaskar, who is going to share what her company and her organization has brought to the market to help patients.
Thank you, Catherine, for the opportunity to discuss Enhansia XR today. Um, the reason why we chose to work on Enhansia XR is because ADHD is a common neurobehavioral disorder, and it's usually diagnosed in childhood, but it persists through adolescence and in adulthood. And it affects almost 5 to 7% of children and adolescents, and up to 5% of adults are also affected by ADHD. And then the core behavioral symptoms of ADHD are persistent inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. As a chronic condition, ADHD symptoms persist past the standard school and work day and have considerable effect throughout the day. So the annual incremental costs of treating ADHD and the economic impact is close to $266 billion only in the United States. So our attempt with Enhansia XR was to actually develop a formulation that is tailored to deal with the full day of symptom control, starting with an early onset so that the early morning hours start off better, and then throughout the day, as well as in the late evening hours when it's time to do housework or homework or after school jobs or after school swim practice. It's really important that we have a medication that covers the full day. So how did people deal with the full day coverage before medicines like Enhansia came on board? Was they either took an immediate release product in the early part of the day to deal with the later onset, or they took an immediate release at the end of the day to deal with symptoms towards the end of the day. And what Enhansia uniquely presents is that full day coverage. And we also worked real hard on the formulation to be able to work on a smart design concept where the patient takes the medication early in the morning, the onset takes care of the early morning symptoms, and then towards the middle of the day the curve actually dips a little bit. Probably our intention for that dip in the afternoon was to facilitate lunchtime appetite, and then the curve rises again to take care of late day symptoms. So our focus was mostly based on the patient's trajectory through the day and how they would manage their symptoms throughout the day. And it's really important to focus on the patient rather than on the medication itself. And that was the desire behind developing Enhansia XR. And there is a significant unmet medical need for a drug like Enhansia, because what really happens when people take an immediate release and an extended release to cover full day symptoms is you lose the benefits of taking once a day medication, which results in less fluctuation in blood levels, and also most importantly in compliance, because now patients have to remember to take their immediate release medication with them to take either later on in the afternoon. So that was the whole purpose of working on this formulation, so that we meet that unmet medical need. And this is one of the first formulations with methylphenidate that actually has the full day symptom control.
Well, thank you. And I guess with respect to patients that have to go from multiple therapies versus one therapy, that is a convenience and possibly a compliance opportunity for individuals. So looking forward to great success for your product, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. So Dr. Schickling, sorry, I apologize for the pronunciation of your name. I would like to call upon you to talk about the additional opportunities that Eli Lilly and Company has brought to the market. If you could share about what your company chose to focus on this additional disease state and the chronic disease and what therapeutic breakthrough has been brought there as well, that would be awesome. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Catherine, and also for the Galien Foundation for arranging this session and having us here speaking today. So yeah, Lilly chose to study baricitinib, this brand name Olumiant, in patients with rheumatoid arthritis as our first indication. And that was selected because rheumatoid arthritis is the most common autoimmune disease. It's a progressive, debilitating disease that affects about 1.3 million people in the USA alone. And the existing therapies that were available at the time of other existing conventional DMARDs, as well as a suite of biological DMARDs or disease-modifying drugs that were available that target specific cytokines, we know that those only provided relief, at least when we measure it by, say, getting to a state of low disease activity, a commonly accepted treatment guideline, that only about 30 or 50% of patients are able to reach that treatment target. And we thought that baricitinib would be able to address this important unmet medical need. So we developed baricitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor, a Janus kinase inhibitor, and specifically it's most selective for JAK1 and JAK2, as a way to help improve the lives of these patients for whom this existing therapies may not fully ameliorate their symptoms of their rheumatoid arthritis. And indeed, baricitinib has done that. We saw clinical responses that were observed as early as 1 week after treatment began. We know that Olumiant, in addition to treating the synovitis, the joint inflammation associated with rheumatoid arthritis, was able to provide some very important reductions in pain and pain relief in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, some as early as a matter of days. So we look at this improvement in pain, and another observation that we noticed was that the pain improvement was observed in patients even taking opioids. So thinking of the public health crisis that opioids has brought in the US, this may provide just another avenue to help control patients' pain without perhaps requiring the opioid treatment, although we need more data to know that for sure. We also know that Olumiant has been able to improve the physical function of patients with rheumatoid arthritis and slow the progression of the joint damage that's associated in the joints within the bones of patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So I'm very happy to say that we've been able to develop Olumiant now for this indication. And, you know, we acted on the need that the belief that there was a medical need in rheumatoid arthritis. And I think that we've been able now to deliver a product that will help patients and the healthcare providers and payers by providing an alternative to what was existing therapies at the time.
Yeah. Well, that is extremely exciting to hear, the individuals that may have been taking opiates with all the opiate crisis, as you mentioned, that this is something that may be used in place of that and hopefully help alleviate the need for those types of medications, though they have their place as well. That could be quite encouraging. Could we stay with you still and ask more about this particular compound? And is there a measurable impact you can cite on the clinical outcome for the patients with this product? And what's been the clinical response so far?
Sure, thank you. So like I said, we in the clinical trial program, we saw that there were patients having response early into treatment, as early as 1 week after treatment began. We have heard from the rheumatologists that are now using this therapy in practice that they're welcoming the addition of another treatment. Baricitinib is orally administered as a once-a-day tablet. And I think they recognize that as contributing to the positive overall benefit risk ratio in a very refractory patient population in the US. Again, we've heard from our practicing rheumatologists, they tell us that the drug works very quickly, and it also seems to be having a maintenance of efficacy that they are very pleased to see, and that their patients, of course, are happy to see that the effect of the drug is maintained over time. And that also has a very manageable safety profile when we use it in our appropriate populations. They also have told us, rheumatologists have told us that they've been impressed with the efficacy of of Olumiant, as many times they use it after patients have failed one and frequently many more of the other previous existing therapies already. So in taking these patients that have refractory disease or become very difficult to treat based on their history of previous therapies that they've been used, that the rheumatologists tell us that they're very encouraged by the efficacy that they see in this population. So we know that globally over 200,000 patients have been treated with Olumiant worldwide, and the response has been quite positive.
That's very encouraging whatsoever. So thank you so much. Thank you for that. And Dr. Platt, understanding that cardiovascular disease is very important, very prevalent in the world, are you able to share the measurable impact that you can cite with the clinical outcomes for patients on the product and what the clinical response has been so far?
Sure, it's a great question, Kathy. So, since the introduction of Entresto, we've had a chance to collect a significant amount of real-world evidence on actual use and real-world use, and what we've seen is findings that are very consistent with our clinical trials. That we see reductions in heart failure hospitalizations in appropriate populations that are treated within systems of care, and we also see total healthcare costs going down that are commensurate with reductions in hospitalizations, which are a major cost driver to systems. And that's even in comparison to what had been a previous standard of care class of drugs, either ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, which Entresto is used in place of. And so I think we're extremely gratified and thankful for the number one, the patients who participated in those trials to be able to, give us this kind of a breakthrough, but also for the implementation side of this kind of a therapy, where we know that it can take 17 years for cardiologists on average to adopt a new treatment innovation in at least half of their patients. We saw that with beta blockers many years ago. So it's interesting to see this treatment actually being implemented and having the effects that we have always hoped through the clinical development program that it would have.
Wow. It takes 17 years to get to the market and then 17 years to get it adopted. That's quite a long time. So congratulations, and great to hear that patients are able to experience the results from this medication. So that is wonderful. Well, for those that are probably participating in listening to this particular webcast, they're probably very familiar with the challenges of drug development and what it takes in order to discover a new medicine, and what it does to find the safety and the efficacy and get it through regulatory approval. But those challenges through proof of concept and ultimately through the trials and so forth are not easy and not surmountable. So what I'm going to ask the panelists, are there any lessons from their experience that they might add so that the public may better understand what's all involved in the innovation process? We often don't talk about this enough. We know it can be long, we know it can be difficult, and we also know it can be quite challenging. So I was going to call upon Dr. Bhaskar again to actually start us off with this particular topic, and can you share with us sort of what those challenges are and what lessons we have learned through this innovation process?
Sure. Thanks again for the opportunity. So I think when we embark on drug development, what we have learned over and over again over the years is to keep the patient and their disease and their symptom control front and center, right? And it is really important that the clinical development plan focuses on generating as much safety and efficacy data so that we are able to address unmet medical needs along the way and generate the data that not only addresses regulators' questions, but ultimately benefits the patient. So for example, bringing it back to Adhansia XR, what we learned through this development process was, first of all, we generated a lot of information about Adhansia XR. And what was really important was to see through the clinical development plan consistency of effect and durability of effect, right? Because it's really important that every clinical trial adds to the evidence and adds to the body of evidence so that we are generating information that in the end shows that the drug is safe and effective. And oftentimes, if the development plan is not targeted or tailored to answering the symptom questions, then it certainly is not adding to the body of evidence.
Thank you for that. I would actually like to call upon one of your colleagues, Dr. Perlman, as well, to share his perspective and add to what you have also shared.
Sure, thank you, Catherine. And Rayvow was not the first selective serotonin 1F agonist that Eli Lilly and company had evaluated in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. An earlier compound was extremely efficacious in clinical trials for the acute treatment of migraine, but unfortunately, this compound could not be brought to market due to toxicological findings. And although this was an expensive undertaking, Lilly chose to double down on their investment and advance a second compound. This compound successfully progressed to ultimately become Rayvow. And the Rayvow program represents an important demonstration of the boundaryless innovation, we champion at Lilly. When preliminary studies showed Rayvow to have promise in migraine, Lilly moved the project forward in a partnered research plan. Lilly helped with the founding of an independent company, Collucid, who actually led the phase 2 and 3 development of Rayvow. And then after efficacy was demonstrated in early phase 3 work, Lilly brought this agent back for an internal development by the acquisition of Collucid. It's important because this approach allows us to maximize our ability to develop important early phase compounds. And this focused and efficient program led to FDA approval, which then has allowed Lilly to initiate international development, leading to submissions in Japan and in the EU. And so this successful effort shows that partnered efforts are often critical in the fast and effective development of new medications in today's world.
Great. So that is awesome to know that often people find partnerships challenging and ask whether or not they are effective or whether they work. And here's an excellent example of that it actually is strategically beneficial to bring products to market. I'd like to call upon Dr. Shitai to share her thoughts on this particular question.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. To follow on something that you mentioned earlier, which is that Vendikal is the first approved treatment for patients with ATTR-CM. It still remains the only approved treatment for patients still with ATTR-CM. And I have to say that being the first in terms of, conducting clinical development in a specific rare disease, there is no shortage of challenges. And that goes, from the early part, even where we think about how do you demonstrate proof of concept, even in the non-clinical space, and particularly in ATTR-CM, there's really a lack of relevant animal models. And what that translates to is really taking forward quite a bit of risk into our clinical trial program as you go into patients who actually have ATTR-CM. And being in a rare disease, oftentimes there's limited natural history data that's available. And so in order to really design an appropriate clinical development program, one needs to understand, as you all know, how does the disease progress to really inform what's the right patient population to include, what are the appropriate clinical trial endpoints so that you can assess, the treatment effect of the medicine. And so lessons learned, as I go through some of the issues, really revolves around thinking early and anticipating, conducting, whether it is through patient registries or some clinical trials, to be able to get some of the information that you need to design the clinical trial. And then, of course, one of the key pieces is engaging with patients. We have to understand what's important in terms of outcomes to patients. And the other piece that I would like to mention is around when one actually needs to conduct the clinical trials. So once you sort of have come up with the design in mind, Being first means there's no regulatory precedence. So engaging with global regulators, I would say early and often to get some alignment around the clinical plan. And in terms of actually executing and conducting the trial, enrolling in a rare disease where there's a limited patient population, how do you identify and get patients diagnosed and subsequently have them enroll? And I would say, one of the points I'd mentioned earlier was around how do you identify and diagnose patients? And one of the key learnings from that is really thinking ahead. How do you get to raise suspicion for the disease? And I would say that, a big effort on the part of Pfizer is really utilizing machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify, whether it's a constellation of signs, symptoms, or other accompanying conditions that might certainly raise a healthcare provider's suspicion for ATTR-CM and get those patients screened and diagnosed, again, as early as possible.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Well, this is absolutely very important and fascinating information about the drug development process. Another question I have for the panelists, and all of you are available to answer this question, is to what degree have patients been involved in the development process? So we read a lot in literature and in the media and so forth that patients are getting consulted with regulatory authorities. There is a desire to have patients involved in the early development process. So can any of you speak to the degree in which patients were involved in the actual development of these medications that are now available to them? Obviously, they were participants in the actual trials and volunteered to be part of that. But can you speak to any other roles or activities they were involved in the actual development throughout before you got to the regulatory approval and so forth? Is there anyone who particularly would like to answer that question? Would you like me to call upon somebody? Okay, I'm going to call upon Dr. Sukhning, please.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we heard in the previous remarks of the importance of bringing the voice of the patient in, and in your remarks and framing up this question. So for the development program for baricitinib, we actually did listen to some patients. We had colleagues doing interviews with patients as well as the rheumatologists to hear directly from them what they valued, where they saw the unmet medical need, what they were desiring in a new therapy or potential therapies. And we were able to learn from them, obviously. Not only did we listen, but we attempted to balance what the patients were telling us. And as we were designing the phase 3 program, we're actually able to incorporate some elements such as a daily electronic diary where patients could report their levels of pain and fatigue and tiredness and morning joint stiffnesses, which were important measures for the patients, obviously for other stakeholders as well. So we were able to take their voice and implement some specific activities within the clinical trials, within our statistical analysis plan, to make sure that those endpoints were featured quite prominently in our statistical analysis plans, and then presented to regulators for their consideration. So I think you're right. It's just a critical piece of the whole process we have to consider.
Great, thank you. Is there others that would like to comment? Oh, Dr. Bhaskar?
So thanks for that really important question, Catherine. It really behooves us as scientists to really focus in on what is it that patients need, right? And so drug development needs to take into account the patient's voice. So what we did during our clinical development plan was encourage patients to fill out their diaries. And so the diary has, of course, the standard data collection tools which can be ordered and categorized, but we also allowed patients to write to us in a free-flowing form what exactly are they experiencing in the trials. And that kind of informed us what else should we be collecting and what else should we be doing. And it also informed, as mentioned by others in this panel, how we designed our statistical analysis. And it was really very well appreciated by the regulators as well, because in the end, it's always the patient experience that really counts towards a lot of decisions that are made in drug development.
Thank you. Well, I have another question for you. As scientists and clinicians, where do you see the next wave of innovation trending in your individual product areas? So now that you have this new great treatment and innovation available for your patients, what is the next wave? Dr. Perlman?
Well, thanks, Catherine. So I would say I work in migraine and pain, and migraine and other chronic pain conditions are sort of complex neurobiologic diseases that involve multiple different aspects of the nervous system, both peripheral nervous system, central nervous system, basic sensory pathways, and complex neurocognitive and executive functioning pathways all factoring in. And obviously, there's not one single mechanism of pain. It's a multifactorial, multi-mechanism disease. And so as we see both selective receptor antagonists and antibodies that bind to other peptides like CGRP, I would expect there to be additional, not just development in new peptides and peptidergic pathways or neurotransmission pathways, but really trying to understand and tailor to the genetics of an individual and what specifically is the etiology of their abnormal pain processing. And so getting back to genetically driven, targeted, personalized medicine, I really see as the next wave as we start looking at new and innovative treatments in many diseases, but especially in pain.
Okay, that will be very interesting with the genetics and the pain. So thank you for sharing that. I think I saw Dr. Sitai also wanting to chime in. So would you like to share your thoughts on this question?
Sure. So in the area of ATTR-CM, there are certainly other products that are now in development for the treatment of ATTR-CM. And many of these products, they do target other points in the amyloid cascade. That is, somewhere along the pathway of amyloid being formed, sticking together, and actually depositing in the organs. So I think in the future, what we may see is some combination of these therapies that target different points in the amyloidogenic cascade. But further to that, I think what we'll probably see, not just in ATTR-CM, but in other forms of cardiomyopathies, especially monogenic cardiomyopathies, is a shift really towards development of treatments that are gene therapies. And I think that's the here and now, where we're seeing a lot of development in the area of gene therapies. And as you know, at Pfizer, we've made a significant investment in the gene therapy platform with a commitment to really advance clinical development and manufacturing for gene therapies. So I think that's where we're headed for sure.
So for the audience, Dr. Platt, yes, please. Would you like to chime in and share your answer on this question?
Yes, thanks, Kathy. Because I really do think this is the question for our time right now for medical professionals in the pharmaceutical industry, because by definition, disruptive treatment innovations are disruptive. They don't always fit into physicians' workflows and care pathways. And so when we look to introduce treatments that could have a population health impact, I think it's also incumbent on us to also bring to the physician community the tools that will allow them to actually implement these kinds of innovations. So, we are spending a lot of time focused on implementation science and doing the research to understand what are the best ways to actually equip physicians and patients with the tools they need to kind of fit these innovations into their treatments. And I see that as an area of major investment moving forward, because I think especially in cardiovascular medicine, where we see pharmaceutical companies to some extent stepping away from this space because of the complexities with implementation and access for patients. If we can figure that part out as part of the way we develop drugs, I think that's going to have a massive impact in the future.
Okay, great. So I've heard mentioned genes and genetic and personalized medicine. Can you talk a bit about how that fits into the chronic disease? Because generally up until now, we've sort of addressed chronic disease as communities or populations. So can someone sort of share with the audience how personalized medicine or genetics sort of fits in the chronic disease? Maybe that's an unfair question because maybe it's different in every sort of area, but could you talk a little bit about how that's going to work and how that's going to happen so the audience is very diverse. I know we have scientists, I know we have researchers, but we also possibly have some lay people here. So who would like to tackle that one? No one? Dr. Perlman, thank you.
Well, yeah, so I brought it up, so I guess I have to at least take a stab at it. But look, I think initially it will be much more simplistic in a sense, in having multiple different mechanisms of action to treat a specific disease, and it's going to be the traditional trial and error, try different combinations and different approaches to find what works for a given patient. But again, with the explosion in sort of genetic technologies and the ability to tease out mechanisms of disease, one would hope that in the future we would have testing that would allow us to pinpoint what the given mechanism is for a given patient, and then you can obviously target therapies to it. And I think it's going to be probably a sort of a herky-jerky path or a roller coaster ride or whatever analogy you want to use to get there. But I think ultimately we will, and I think it's going to vary with different diseases in terms of the time course and the path that we follow.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. We have a question here from the audience. This is in the cardio realm, so that probably addresses certain members of our panel. So one of our audience members wants to know, how can we utilize electronic health records to identify new treatment opportunities and create a blueprint for drug development? So I think this gets to the real world data and looking at historical and so forth. I don't want to put words in this person's mouth, but that's sort of the question. So Dr. Platt, what are your thoughts?
Sure, and it's a great question. I think a lot of us struggle with that question, is how do we best leverage just the mountains of data that come out of electronic health records? And, when it comes to drug development, I think one of the things that I think we all see is the challenges with getting patients access from a payer standpoint to treatment innovations. And a lot of that is due to the fact that you have to wait until you get a product out on the market to be able to collect a lot of real world data on how it's being used. And wouldn't it be amazing if we had a learning health system where you already had that structure, the infrastructure set up, so that when you introduce a treatment innovation, it can get plugged in the right way with the appropriate patients in a system where you can collect all of the data from the EHR in a very streamlined way, and then be able to understand very quickly what the healthcare utilization impact is of a new treatment, what the quality of life impact is of a new treatment. We all care about patient satisfaction, these days with systems of care as well. So how can we use all of that data to really create a learning health system where you can get that information to payers very quickly? You can get the kind of access that patients need to be able to benefit from these products very quickly after you introduce these innovations, so that we're not waiting years to get the kind of data that payers or systems of care really want to see in order to actually implement therapy. So I definitely think that's integral to what we have to be doing in the future as we develop these kinds of treatment innovations.
Thank you. And Dr. Sitai, do you have thoughts on this topic?
Oh, I agree with the comments that were made, and I think particularly for myself, where I work within the rare disease organization, utilizing that data to really help inform where are the gaps, where are patients' needs, and understand the prevalence, right, the epidemiology of certain conditions, and then more so, what's meaningful to actually drive an impact that is meaningful, not just to patients, which is the primary focus, but also what we deliver to the health system as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We have another question from the audience that talks about dealing with regulatory authorities. So when you're talking to the FDA and when the mechanism of action is maybe not as well known, and now you have a treatment for a given chronic illness, how do those dealings with the FDA sort of occur? They actually, the question is around how flexible is the FDA when the mechanisms of action may not be as clear or as well known and so forth. So I think this individual is trying to understand how those conversations go, how do those discussions go, how do drugs how do trials and how do they actually make decisions in those particular areas. So I'm not sure if all the panelists here actually deal with the regulatory authorities or whether that's a topic for somebody else. So I want to actually check on domain because I don't know if we're equipped to answer that question. Is that something we should table and probably need to take offline, or is that something you guys are comfortable addressing? Okay, Dr. Pullman saying, yeah, okay, yeah. So since we've got Dr. Sitai already here on the screen, we'll start with you and then we'll go over to other panelists as necessary. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, and I think I mentioned this point earlier, particularly either when you're working with a new drug or, in a new therapeutic area or disease. I mentioned the point about engaging early and often with the regulators. And I think that holds true regardless of how much you do or don't know. Obviously, the more you know, right, the more information you're able to take forward to the regulatory agencies, including FDA, the more robust or specific the discussions can be, particularly when you'd like to get some resolution around specific questions, whether it relates to, the right patient population that the particular medicine may work in, based on its mechanism of action and what you think the potential therapeutic benefit is. So I think there are certainly some specific times along the development continuum that we specifically engage with the regulators, whether it's before going into our first patient with a new medicine, or specifically at the end of proof of concept before you want to go into the very large clinical trial. So there are specific times that we definitely engage with the regulatory agencies, but there are other times where there is absolute flexibility in terms of determining, when there are questions that there is an openness definitely from the regulators that I've interacted with over the years to engage early and often.
Okay, great. That is very helpful. And Dr. Schickling, I think you had something to offer as well.
Well, yeah, I waved my hand, and I think Dr. Sitai just covered the main points I was going to make as well, of having those early discussions with the regulators and ask them what would be valuable to them or help them in their decision making, and bringing in applying the mechanism of action to, clinical results, clinical findings, and outcomes. I think is just one of the best ways to set the stage. So that way, when you do get there and submit your dossier and get under regulatory review, hopefully you can provide the agencies with the data that they're most interested in and that's most relevant to the patient population.
Okay, thank you. So I think we should probably bring up the poll and let's have a look at what people said. And I want to give the panel an opportunity to actually react to it because they didn't actually have a chance to answer. So could we bring up the poll results so the audience can see those? Okay, so here's the question again, and here's the responses that individuals gave. Can you all see that? Yep, okay. So now you obviously get to answer in your head. What do you think about the answers, and what do you think this means for moving forward in your sort of your chronic illness area that you're currently working with? And I guess, you know, this is all about the future. And so when you think about, you know, the Galien Awards Committee, maybe 5 years down the road from now, and you think about maybe sitting in this chair and what you might be presenting and so forth, as well as these questions. Whoops, my answers went away. Did I make them go away? Oh, thank you. What are your thoughts about the responses or the question? What are your thoughts? Dr. Cechak?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not surprised by the results that I see there in the poll. I think, you know, in general, folks are concerned about access and affordability, and so enabling universal access, I could understand that being a significant priority. I think just given the environment or climate that we're in at the moment, I thought maybe that the last point around, you know, trust in science might have come up greater, as I think, as, you know, in this time that we're in with COVID-19, that there's been a lot of discussion about trust in science and, you know, and the review and approval process for, you know, whether it be treatments or vaccines in this time. So I have to say, not surprised, but I did think the last one may have come up a little higher.
Dr. Perlman?
Yeah, I agree. I also think it's not surprising as well. Access and sort of that population health is important. I think especially for this group, when you talk about the chronic diseases, whether they're incredibly common or very rare, there was sort of a theme around under recognition, under diagnosis, under treatment, and you know, how are we going to address that, but through widespread education to the patients that suffer from these diseases but aren't seeking care, to the providers that don't recognize the impact that the disease is having on the patient and therefore don't necessarily treat as aggressively as one might hope. And this is in primary care as well as in specialty care. And so it's not surprising when you look at the unmet need in chronic diseases that there would be a need to really bolster that widespread education and information dissemination.
Dr. Platt?
Kathy, coming from an institution or an organization that's very focused on population health, I was very gratified to see number 2 rising to the top as well. You know, I don't think we make full use of the treatments that we currently have when it comes to broad sort of population approaches. So, you know, great example, if you look at LDL cholesterol, major causal risk factor for atherosclerosis, and the use of mainstay therapy, statin drugs. Upwards of 80% of patients who are on statin drugs don't actually reach their target LDL cholesterol levels based on guidelines. So how can we take a population health approach to addressing that challenge, right? We know we have a target there that we can impact. We have tools to be able to do it, but patients aren't fully benefiting from that. So I think a big part of the future of healthcare is trying to really put the systems in place to get these patients to benefit and get the full benefit from the treatments we already have, to really maximize their impact on society. So it's very nice to see that there's a lot of focus on that out there.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bhaskar?
I'm actually not very surprised that universal access to medicines and vaccines ranked among the top, because I think given the current health crisis and global pandemic environment, I'm sure everybody is kind of worried how, when a vaccine comes out, and it will definitely come out, is how do people get access to it? Like, is there going to be a tiered approach? Like, who gets this? And of course, when any family member or any person is suffering from a chronic health condition, access to medicine becomes almost a fundamental right, right? I mean, so I'm not surprised by the answers at all. I think it's very spot on.
Well, thank you for that. And Dr. Schickling, who's working on COVID-19, will get the final word.
Oh, well, I didn't have a comment on COVID. We'll save that one for another day. I think that could take us another whole hour there if we wanted to talk about what's going on there. I was just thinking of tying the question around the prevention piece, even into rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, we're still talking about treatments and ameliorating symptoms once they occur, but we know that in patients, to some patients, that they get changes in their blood markers appear early if they're at risk for rheumatoid. And it just always makes me wonder, is there a way to intervene on these patients even early and prevent the signs and symptoms from fully developing and the bone damage from occurring? And, what can we learn from the personalized medicine discussion that we had earlier and apply it so that patients never even feel the full brunt of the disease before we can treat them?
Well said. So thank you. So thank you. I really love to extend a thank you on behalf of the Galien Foundation, the organizers, the chairs, for having all of you join us today on this webinar. All of these individuals are nominees for the award tomorrow night. So I want to wish you good luck and hope the celebration goes quite well. You all have worked very, very hard to get this far. To the patients, thank you for everything you've done to bring these medicines to market. The ceremony starts tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And there's an award ceremony, cocktails. I realize we don't have the opportunity to get together face-to-face for everybody. I encourage people to get dressed up, put on their ball gowns, whatever they're comfortable with, their shorts, their t-shirts, whatever works for them. And to actually see who the winners are. This is the Nobel Prize of the industry, to really recognize the work, the effort, the science, and everything that goes in to be able to help make people live healthier, longer lives. And it's also the opportunity for the 2002 Regulus Pro Bono Honorary Award winner, Dr. William Faggy. He will be acknowledged and be able to recognize the efforts that he's had there. So that will be a great celebration. And then also, please stay for the rest of the sessions today. You have some great moderators and some great sessions yet to come. And then before the ceremony tomorrow, you'll have the opportunity to be hosted by your two co-chairs, Dr. Susan Desmond-Hellman and Dr. Michael Rosenblatt, who have been instrumental in putting this program on. And they'll have an awesome program around immunology, the COVID-19 vaccine, the next 50 years of innovation, and the futures in therapeutics. So there still is a lot more to come. Please join us. And again, thank you to all of you that were here. And I really appreciate all the time and effort that you've put into everything you've done. And I wish you a great rest of your day. All the best.
Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best pharmaceutical product.